Films which belong to the war genre often serve to evoke sympathy for those who suffer at the hands of forces which they cannot control. As a result, the dominant representation of children within such films is that they are the helpless victims of adult violence. Both Isao Takahata's Grave of the Fireflies and Guillermo del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth are war films which center on the suffering of children. However, they differ in one substantial way: the group of society which is blamed for this suffering. Pan's Labyrinth is a Spanish and American dark fantasy war film released in 2006 by Esperanto Filmoj and Warner Bros. Studios. The story takes place in Spain during the summer of 1944. Although this is 5 years after the Spanish Civil War, there is a heavy focus on the impact of war on Ophelia, a young girl who travels with her pregnant mother to meet Captain Vidal, her abusive stepfather. Vidal is trying to put an end to what remains of the anti-fascist rebellion, while Ophelia becomes embroiled in a magical quest given to her by a faun, who tells her that she is the princess of an underground realm.
Vos sois la princesa Moana, hija del rey de Bezmorra, el reino subterráneo.
The story is heavily entangled between these two parallel narratives, and Del Toro ensures that the film remains polysemic. We never receive full clarification on whether the fantasy world is real or simply Ophelia's coping mechanism for the world's cruelty. Despite this, one thing remains clear from the very first close-up of Ophelia, where she lies bleeding on the floor after Vidal shoots her and takes her baby brother: that the apathy of the adult world is to blame for Ophelia's suffering. None of the adults give Ophelia the care that she needs due to their focus on the war. When Vidal confronts Ophelia outside the labyrinth, there is only empty air where Ophelia sees the faun. Ophelia's mother insists that magic does not exist and is far more concerned with her own pregnancy. And even Mercedes, the housekeeper who becomes close to Ophelia, admits that she does not believe in magic anymore. Her attention is centered on aiding the rebels. Throughout the narrative, Del Toro points an accusing finger at the adult world, and thus the R-rated film is targeted at adults and not children. In both films, we know from the start that the children will die because Del Toro and Takahata begin their films similarly, with the children lying neglected on the floor. Despite this, there is one key difference. The only information that Del Toro gives us before this shot is about the war, and the audience immediately speculates that Ophelia's death is a result of this war. Whereas in the 1986 Japanese animation, Grave of the Fireflies, teenage Seita lies on the floor of a train station, a place often associated with the fast-paced modernity of Japan. Takahata uses a high-angle wide shot to emphasize the way in which society literally dodges his suffering. There is no indication of a connection to the war other than the date, and thus the audience connects Seita's death to the apathy of the modern world. Although the film gained most of its notoriety only after Roger Ebert called it one of the greatest anti-war films of all time, there's a reason why Takahata so strongly insisted that the film is not an anti-war anime. The film was released by Studio Ghibli, which typically makes films that focus on a child's view of the world. It was initially unsuccessful for the studio because it was released as a double feature with the fantasy film My Neighbor Totoro. Parents were expecting to take their children to see a light-hearted cartoon, and were faced with Grave of the Fireflies, which is often rated as one of the saddest films of all time. But Takahata didn't just choose to release it as a double feature to make small children cry. He did it because the youth of 1980s Japan were his target audience. He doesn't blame the adult-created violence of the Second World War for the suffering of Seita and Setsuko. He blames the apathetic nature of a society which refuses to respect its elders, whom he felt had suffered through one of the darkest points in Japan's history. During the 1980s, Japan had become an economic powerhouse, and many felt as if the memory of an entire generation's suffering had been forgotten. As society advanced, there was a shift away from long-held traditions. Takahata gives no context about the war or the enemy, unlike in Pan's Labyrinth, where it is clear that Vidal and the fascists are a direct cause of Ophelia's suffering. Takahata blames the shift away from tradition most clearly when Seita explains that he has traded everything away for rice, including his mother's kimono. The kimono, as a symbol of traditional Japan, is traded for consumer goods, allowing Takahata to indicate the way in which consumerism has weakened Japanese tradition and that the youth is to blame. Furthermore, by refusing to live with his aunt, Seita refuses traditional Japanese family values. It is clear that the film blames Seita for the death of his sister because he trades tradition for short-term comfort, and as the film puts it, refuses to One of Takahata's intentions with making Seita wear a fire brigade uniform was to connect him with the school uniforms of his modern-day contemporaries. Perhaps most telling of Takahata's blame of the youth of 1980s Japan is the scene where the girls in Western clothing arrive home with their Western technology. The girls are representations of the Japanese youth of the 1980s. They are affluent and apathetic to the suffering that happened so close to their own homes. As if to drive the point home, the film ends with an extreme wide shot of Setsuko and Seita gazing over modern-day Kobe. The difference in color between the two halves of the frame create binary opposition between the individuals and the collective. Through this, Takahata emphasizes how a generation fell through the cracks in Japan's memory, and points an accusatory finger at those below, who live amongst the glittering lights of modern-day Japan. Regardless of where the blame is placed, Del Toro and Takahata agree on one thing: the nature of innocence. Del Toro uses flowers throughout the film as symbols of immortality. Though Ophelia dies within the cruel world of Captain Vidal, her innocence lives on within the underground fairy tale realm. In doing so, she escapes the world which is governed by time and becomes a timeless fairy tale, a record of the permanence of innocence. While Setsuko and Seita live for only a short time, like the fireflies in the film which only live for one night, their innocence lives on with their spirits. This innocence is symbolized by the candy box which Setsuko carries around with her, which is returned to her by Seita at the beginning of the film. Both Del Toro and Takahata use symbolism to suggest that innocence, while both fragile and valuable, is also eternal.